Hello, welcome to this short video presentation of my book, Transgenerational Therapy. This book is for a large audience, curious and professionals. In this book, I share 15 years of therapeutical practice for all those who would like to know more on transgenerational dynamics. The readers will find out about the very ancient background of this approach and its rediscovery over the last 30 years. It is not yet very known in the English-speaking countries, but since 15 years it's a very trendy topic in the French-speaking countries, and my original French book is a bestseller in that field. Clearly, this approach deserves to be better known, and contrary to some prejudice, it is not a superficial work, but a practice that can bring profound changes. But before presenting the book, just a few words to define what are transgenerational inheritances. The word transgenerational refers to what is passed on from one generation to the next. For example, we can observe first physiological and morphological heritages, such as the eye and hair color. Secondly, of course, material legacies, estates, land, and so on. Third, psychological inheritances, such as character, moral values, beliefs. And fourth, more existential legacies, linked, for example, to long-term projects such as the perpetuation of a family business. You can see this like father and son moving and storage enterprise. When we talk about heritage between generations, we must distinguish two types of transmission: intergenerational versus transgenerational. Intergenerational inheritances are transmitted consciously from a parent to a descendant. This is the visible part of the iceberg. These legacies are about life experience. They have an explicit discourse, for example, when a grandfather teaches his grandson to sail, or when he passes on his family story, and so on. In contrast, we speak of transgenerational heritages for all that is passed on unconsciously or unwillingly. This is the invisible part of the iceberg. Among these heritages, there are biological factors and the DNA, which can transmit traces of potentially problematic experiences. There are also all those unfinished or unintegrated stories of our ancestors, which are unconsciously passed on and will influence the destiny of the following generations. This may concern family secrets, unresolved conflicts, trauma, unspoken words, unfinished mournings, everything that has influenced the destiny of a family and therefore will affect the descendant. If it is easy to assimilate intergenerational legacies because they are conscious, transgenerational legacies condition our lives because they often remain unconscious. Of course, the therapeutical work addresses the transgenerational heritages. Famous French psychotherapist Serge Tisseron explained that family secrets affect up to 3 generations. And for Françoise Dolto, it takes 3 generations to produce a psychosis. An undone grief can cause infertility in the next generation, or breakups 3 generations later. A bankruptcy can be repeated 2 generations apart, and so on. But even if it is clear that our existence is a continuation of our family lines, we are not, however, just the product of our conditioning. Actually, we also have resources to assimilate this unconscious baggage, to integrate it and make it a strength. In other words, to free ourselves from the transmission legacies, we must learn to integrate them. My book, Transgenerational Therapy, Healing the Inherited Burden, aims precisely at showing how to recognize and integrate one's inherited burdens. In the introduction, I give a more complete definition of transgenerational inheritances. And to give the reader a first idea, I already present several examples of therapy. In the first chapter, I expose a series of situations that allows the reader to better understand the importance and the scope of transgenerational legacies. They are also found in the culture, for example in fairy tales. In Sleeping Beauty, the transmission of an undone grief is represented by Carabosse, who comes to cast a spell on the child's crib. In this first chapter, I also make references to the pioneer Freud, Jung, Zondi, Abraham and Torok, who recognized the importance of transgenerational legacies and the difficulty that they can bring to the descendant. The next chapter traces the history and origin of this concern for the links between generations. It started with the cult of ancestor in the first societies and continues through antiquity, Greece in particular, until its rediscovery in psychotherapy in the last 30 years. Ancient Chinese proverb explains, "To forget one's ancestor is to be a stream without a source, a tree without roots." Egypt and Greece had already proposed mythological genealogies that serve as a model and point of origin for the population. Each difficulty, each symptom has its own prehistory. Addressing the timeless and symbolic dimension of the unconscious, transgenerational analysis traces the development of a given problem. If necessary, it takes us back several generations. In our modern society, we have forgotten the importance of these transgenerational heritages, but it doesn't mean that they are not still influencing our life, except when we manage to clarify them. As Otto von Habsburg said, "He who does not know where he comes from cannot know where he's going because he does not know where he is." So, instead of constantly scooping out a leaky boat, transgenerational analysis proposes to repair what is invisible below the waterline. In the next chapter, I invite the reader to deepen the analysis, that is to say, to better understand how transgenerational legacies are transmitted. Using examples from the literature and from my own therapeutical practice, I explain what happens to those who generate a transgenerational legacy. It is the impossibility of integrating an experience that creates what can be called a transferential necessity, in other words, a tendency to project one's unfinished story onto relatives and in particular onto children. In the following chapter, I explain what happens on the side of the ears, on the receiving end, if you will. Here I analyze different ways of reacting to people who repress or deny their unintegrated experiences. Let us now turn to the work of integration itself. Goethe explained why it is important to integrate one's heritage. We must assimilate the heritage of our ancestors until it becomes a part of ourselves, if we want it to be an enrichment rather than a burden. and contrary to some modern transgenerational approaches that are sometimes a bit superficial, the point here is not to cut or free yourself from your prehistory. As it has been explained since ever, we should learn to integrate this heritage and so maintain a relationship with our roots and with the living forces here and now. In truth, what would become a tree without its roots? In the integration works, it is always the symptoms here and now that serves as a compass to help analyzing the transgenerational unconscious. Anxieties, psychosomatic problems, relationship difficulties, sexual and existential problems are analyzed in relation to unfinished and unintegrated experiences of the parents, who may also have inherited them from their own parents and from the society at large. All the work consists in recognizing and associating the same pattern, or the most significant elements. This guides the work into an introspective direction, which provides meaning to an experience. It will help to change attitude and reactions, provide new perspectives, until the person comes up with its own natural solution, more constructive. Since we are dealing with unconscious elements, it is clear that this often involves transferences, which should ideally be analyzed and overcome before the end of the therapeutical work. To cover all the points discussed in the previous chapter, I dedicate this 7th chapter to the presentation of a fantastic ancient model of transgenerational therapy. It is the story of Oedipus that Sophocles recounts in his tragedies. Nobody so far had seen the transgenerational teaching that hides between the lines of this legendary myth. But thanks to the transgenerational analysis, we move away from the modern interpretation of the Oedipal complex to recapture the ancient wisdom that underlies the work of Sophocles. And of course, this ancient wisdom always refers to the importance of transgenerational inheritances. In that perspective, Oedipus is above all the victim of a family secret. Indeed, his parent did not tell him he was adopted. This lack of transmission of his origins will lead him to live the tragedy we know. But this was a necessary passage for him to discover the truth about his origin and to be finally reborn. His so-called tragedy then becomes clearly the story of a cathartic and healing process. By discovering the true identity of his biological parents, Oedipus will recover from the alienation induced by the secret of his birth. As Sophocles explained in his last play, after his journey through the desert, at the end of his integration process, Oedipus becomes the hero of Colonus and the guarantor of the prosperity of his host. The transgenerational analysis also shows that Oedipus had inherited the unfinished grief of his grandfather Pentheus. As he was king of Thebes, Pentheus was killed by his own mother as she was in trance on Mount Citeron. 2 generations later, at the same place, history almost repeats itself for Oedipus, also victim of an attempted infanticide. For sure, he is alienated by this other, the ghost of King Pentheus, whose mourning had not been done by the population. This explains why he will unconsciously find himself on the throne of his grandfather in a replacement posture and clearly not as himself. At Colonus, thanks to the hospitality of Theseus, Oedipus completes his healing and will leave a secret that will guarantee the prosperity of its hosts. This is a beneficial transmission that punctuates the work of integration. The metamorphosis of Oedipus at Colonus is a fantastic teaching for integrating transgenerational legacies. It is very useful to better understand the stages of therapeutic process. In the last chapter, I take up the famous and ancient maxim, become who you are if you can discover it. Through other examples of transgenerational therapy, I again show how it is possible to discover the meaning of certain difficulties, to make peace with one's transgenerational heritage, to reconnect with oneself and be rooted. In the conclusion, I explain that transgenerational analysis is not only about psychological problems. It also offers keys to give more meaning to one's previous experiences. It also helps coping with all possible future challenges. We have now come to the end of this short presentation. You can order this book in libraries, online, and on the website of my publisher, Genesis Edition. Thank you for your attention.